In the heart of New York City, billionaire Richard Coleman made a cruel bet in front of his powerful friends he'd give a barefoot 11-year-old girl $100 million if she could open his unbreakable safe. The room filled with laughter until the girl, Emily Johnson, looked him in the eye and said something that wiped the smiles off every face. That was the moment when arrogance met truth. New York City glittered that morning like it always did, with the kind of light that made glass towers look holy and the people inside them feel untouchable. From the top floor of the Coleman Tower, the view stretched endlessly over the Hudson River, the city humming below like a living engine fueled by ambition and money. Inside, everything gleamed: marble floors, custom Italian furniture, rare art on the walls. It wasn't just an office, it was a shrine to wealth and power. And its high priest, Richard Coleman, loved every inch of it. At 53, Richard had the face of a man who had spent his life winning. His suits were tailored in London, his shoes hand-polished by someone whose name he couldn't remember, and his smile carried the confidence of a man who could buy anything except humility. He'd built Coleman Investments from the ground up, transforming small real estate deals into a multi-billion-dollar empire. People called him a genius, a visionary, a self-made man. He liked that phrase. It made him forget that his father had left him a 7-figure trust fund to start with. That morning, Richard was in a particularly playful mood. The boardroom was full, 5 other men in sleek suits, each one a titan in his own right: Ethan Carter, oil magnate from Texas; Mark Bradley, venture capitalist from Silicon Valley; Peter Lang, pharmaceutical heir; and Charles and Frank, lifelong friends who ran a private equity firm that had swallowed smaller businesses for breakfast. Together they made up a circle of influence that shaped markets and manipulated headlines without breaking a sweat. They laughed loudly, drank expensive coffee, and talked about power as if it were their birthright. On the far side of the room, quietly sweeping the floor, was Maria Johnson, a woman in her late 30s whose uniform had faded from years of detergent and whose eyes carried the exhaustion of survival. Her hands were raw from cleaning chemicals, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were always expecting to be yelled at. Mary had been working for Coleman Tower for 8 years, arriving before sunrise, leaving long after the city lights came on. She was invisible to these men, a moving shadow that kept their world spotless without ever existing in it. That day she wasn't alone. Her daughter, Emily Johnson, sat quietly near the corner, clutching an old backpack against her chest. Emily was 11, small for her age, with curly brown hair tied in a messy ponytail and eyes that seemed to see far more than any child should. Maria hadn't wanted to bring her company policy strictly forbade it, but she'd had no choice. Her neighbor, who usually watched Emily, had fallen sick, and Maria couldn't afford to miss a day's work. When Richard Coleman entered the room, Maria froze like she'd been caught stealing. She whispered an apology, explaining that she'd only brought her daughter because she had no other option. Richard glanced at Emily, then at Maria, and the faintest smirk played across his face. "You brought your kid to work?" he said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Well, isn't that adorable?" his friends chuckled, sensing the familiar cruelty in his voice. Emily lowered her gaze, trying not to draw attention, but Richard wasn't done. He gestured toward the large titanium safe that stood like a silver monolith beside his desk, a Swisstech Titanium X900, the most advanced personal safe in North America. It had cost him $3 million, and he liked to remind people that fact every chance he got. "You see that safe, kid?" he asked, stepping closer. "That thing's worth more than your mom will make in 100 years. Nobody on this floor can open it without me. Not even the FB could crack it." The men laughed again, their voices bouncing off the glass walls. Ethan Carter slapped the table and said, "Maybe the kid wants to give it a try. Could be fun, huv Richard." The others joined in, their laughter growing louder, feeding off each other's arrogance. Maria's face flushed red. "Please, sir, we'll leave right now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Emily won't touch anything, I promise." But Richard lifted a hand, pretending to think. No, let's make this interesting," he said, grinning. "How about a little game? I'll give this girl here $100 million if she can open my safe." The room erupted in laughter so loud that even the glass seemed to vibrate. Frank wiped a tear from his eye, choking on his own amusement. $100 million? You were crazy, Richard." Peter added, "The girl probably doesn't even know how much that is. She'll think it's monopoly money." Emily sat still, her small fingers gripping the straps of her backpack. Maria reached for her, but Richard's voice stopped her cold. "Relax, Maria. It's just a little entertainment. You work for me, you should at least let me have some fun." The men cheered him on, enjoying the performance. They saw nothing wrong with humiliating a janitor's child. In their world, cruelty was just another expression of dominance. Richard looked at Emily again, waiting for her to react. The girl's face was unreadable, her brown eyes calm and steady. Something about that composure irritated him. He crouched down to her level, his cologne heavy in the air. "Do you even know how much $100 million is, sweetheart?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Emily nodded slightly. "It's a lot of money," she said softly. Richard laughed. "More than a lot. It's more than your family will ever see. It's the difference between me and you, between people who make the world move and people who just clean up after it." His words hit Maria like a physical blow. She wanted to speak, to defend her daughter, but her throat closed up. For years she had endured the casual insults, the dismissive glances, the feeling of being furniture in other people's lives. But this, watching her child become the target, was something else entirely. Emily didn't cry. She looked up at Richard with a quiet steadiness that seemed far too adult for her age. "If nobody can open it," she asked, "then why would you offer me money for something that's impossible?" The laughter stopped for a moment, not silent, but staggered. Richard blinked, caught off guard. "What did you say?" Emily repeated the question. "If the safe can't be opened, then you don't have to give me anything. So you're not really offering $100 million, are you? You're just pretending." Richard's grin faltered, and his friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, the joke didn't feel so funny. He forced a chuckle, brushing it off. "You're a clever little thing, aren't you? But clever doesn't open safes, honey. Money does. Education does things your mom doesn't have." Maria flinched, but Emily didn't look away. She kept her eyes on him, and for a brief, unsettling second, Richard felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of shame, or maybe fear. He straightened up and laughed again, louder than before, as if to drown it out. "All right then," he said, turning to his guests. "Let's see if our young genius can prove me wrong. Go ahead, Emily, the safe's right there." Emily stayed where she was. Her voice was calm when she replied, "I don't need to touch it. I already know how it works." Richard's laughter stopped this time. He frowned, studying her face. "What do you mean, you know how it works?" The girl tilted her head slightly. "My dad used to build safes like that. He taught me about them." The men exchanged glances, half amused, half intrigued. Richard tried to scoff, but something about Emily's confidence held him back. For a man who believed he controlled every situation, this moment felt like the first crack in his perfect armor. Maria Johnson had learned how to move through other people's worlds without leaving a trace. She knew how to make herself smaller, quieter, almost invisible. Years of scrubbing executive offices, buffing marble floors, and emptying trash cans in the Coleman Tower had taught her one truth: people with money didn't like being reminded of those who cleaned up after them. Every morning she would ride the service elevator to the top floors long before the suits arrived, pushing her cart of supplies past doors that cost more than her yearly salary. She never complained, never asked for favors, never caused trouble. That's how she kept her job. Her day usually started before dawn in a tiny apartment in the Bronx, a one-bedroom space that used to be a storeroom, now converted into a home through her own determination and duct tape. The paint peeled near the ceiling, the floor creaked with every step, and the single window faced a brick wall. Still, Maria called it a blessing. She'd grown up poor in a small town in Georgia where work was scarce and dreams died quietly. At least here in New York, there was work. There was a chance for her daughter. That morning had started like any other until the phone call came. Her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who usually watched Emily while Maria worked, was coughing violently on the other end. "Honey, I don't think I can take the girl today," she said, her voice weak. "The flu's got me bad." Maria's heart sank. Missing a shift wasn't an option. The building management had warned her last year that one more absence could cost her job. She couldn't risk it. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and she barely had half the money. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Maria said gently, trying not to sound desperate. "Please get some rest. I'll figure something out." She hung up and turned to Emily, who was sitting at the small kitchen table doing homework under the flicker of a cheap lamp. "Mija," she said, using the affectionate Spanish word that had slipped into her speech despite years of living in New York. "You'll have to come with me today. Just for a few hours. Stay quiet, don't talk to anyone, okay?" Emily nodded. She was used to days like this. At 11, she'd already seen more of the adult world than most kids her age. While other children spent their Saturdays at dance class or soccer practice, Emily had spent hers sitting quietly in lobbies, reading from secondhand library books while her mother mopped floors in the background. She didn't complain. She understood. Her mom worked hard because life had taken something precious from them. Her dad, David Johnson, had been a brilliant man with rough hands and an easy smile. An engineer who specialized in security systems, he had spent years designing safe mechanisms and alarm networks for banks and corporate clients. He loved puzzles, loved the challenge of building something that couldn't be broken. "Every lock tells a story," he used to say to Emily, letting her play with scraps of code or tiny circuits from his workshop. "The question is, are you smart enough to listen?" Emily would giggle, pretending to decode imaginary passwords on his laptop. Those were the best days before the accident. It happened 2 years earlier. David had been inspecting a system installation at a major financial institution in Midtown Manhattan when a faulty electrical connection triggered a surge. The blast killed him instantly. The company called it a tragic malfunction, offered standard condolences, and denied responsibility. They claimed David had violated safety protocol. The insurance company followed suit, citing technical loopholes to avoid paying benefits. Overnight, Maria went from being a teacher's assistant with a stable life to a widow drowning in debt. She sold almost everything: furniture, jewelry, even David's beloved toolkits, just to keep Emily fed. When the last savings vanished, she applied for cleaning jobs. Her first shift at Coleman Tower had been humiliating. She'd cleaned floors while executives walked past her like she was furniture. But over time she learned to wear invisibility like armor. Each night she came home exhausted, but she never let Emily see the full weight of her pain. "We're going to be okay," she'd whisper as she tucked her daughter into bed. "You're going to have the life your father wanted for you." Emily believed her, even when she saw her mother's swollen hands and blistered feet. That particular morning, Maria, dressed in her faded navy uniform, tying her hair back tightly, she checked her reflection: clean, neat, acceptable. Emily wore yellow sweater 2 sizes too big, a hand-me-down from a church donation box. Maria packed her daughter's backpack with a peanut butter sandwich, a notebook, and an old tablet that sometimes froze mid-screen. "You stay near me," she reminded her, "no wandering around." The subway ride downtown was crowded, filled with the usual morning rush: businessmen scrolling through emails, baristas clutching coffee trays, a few kids in school uniforms. Emily sat beside her mother, quietly tracing letters on the foggy train window. Maria watched her and felt that familiar mix of pride and fear. Emily was bright, too bright sometimes, with a mind that didn't miss anything. She'd inherited David's sharp curiosity and quiet confidence. But the world wasn't kind to poor kids with big brains. It chewed them up, convinced them to shrink their dreams until they fit into smaller boxes. When they reached the Coleman Tower, Maria guided Emily through the employee entrance at the back, flashing her to the sleepy security guard who didn't bother to look up. The service elevator groaned as it climbed 42 floors, the hum of machinery echoing through the narrow shaft. Maria tried to think of where she could safely keep her daughter for a few hours. The janitorial lounge was small and always full of cleaning carts. The storage room had no windows. The lobby floor was off limits. Finally, she decided the boardroom would be empty until noon. She could clean it early while Emily waited in the corner. It was supposed to be a simple plan: get in, clean fast, get out before anyone noticed. But fate had other ideas. By 9 a.m., Maria was polishing the glass table when the door swung open without warning. She froze, rag in hand, as a tall man in an expensive suit stepped in: Richard Coleman himself. Behind him came his entourage of investors, all talking loudly, laughing, shaking hands. Maria's stomach twisted. She hadn't finished cleaning. She hadn't even gotten to the floor. And Emily was right there, sitting on one of the leather chairs, her feet barely touching the ground. Richard glanced around, annoyed. "Why is there someone in here? We were about to start a meeting." Maria stammered an apology, explaining about her daughter, promising she'd leave right away. She could feel Emily's small hand gripping hers, tight with fear. But Richard wasn't listening. His gaze had already landed on the sleek titanium safe near his desk, the one he loved to brag about. And when he looked back at the barefoot little girl in the oversized sweater, an idea began to form. The kind that made rich men feel powerful. "Leave her," he said finally. "Maybe she can give us a show." Maria's heart dropped. She knew that tone, the one rich people used when they wanted to turn someone's life into entertainment. But before she could protest, the men laughed, clapping their boss on the back. They thought it was all a joke. And in Richard's world, everything was a joke, especially the pain of people beneath him. Emily looked from her mother to the men in suits. She didn't understand why they were laughing, but she could feel something wrong in the air. The same kind of wrong she'd felt when men in ties came to their apartment after her father's death, speaking softly about liability and policy, while her mother's face crumbled. She'd seen that look before, the one people wore when they thought they were untouchable. Maria's instincts screamed at her to take her daughter and run, but she couldn't move. Her job, her rent, their survival, everything hung by a thread held in Richard Coleman's manicured hand. So she stood there, frozen in place, while the room turned into a stage for the cruelest kind of show. That was how Emily Johnson, daughter of a janitor and a dead engineer, found herself standing in front of a billionaire's safe, in a room full of laughter that didn't belong to her, about to teach the richest man in New York a lesson he would never forget. The boardroom of Coleman Tower was not built for mercy. It was made of glass and metal, polished surfaces that reflected wealth like a mirror made to remind everyone who truly mattered. The massive windows overlooked the city skyline, the Hudson shimmering below like a blade of silver. Every corner of the room screamed power, from the mahogany table that could seat 20 executives to the towering painting of Richard Coleman himself, commissioned by a European artist at a cost that could have fed an entire neighborhood for a year. That morning, the air inside was charged with the self-importance of men who had forgotten what hunger felt like. Maria Johnson stood near the corner, her cleaning supplies neatly packed on the cart beside her. She had been halfway through wiping the last of the smudges from the glass wall when Richard and his group of investors entered. Her heart jumped into her throat. She shouldn't have been there. She should have finished earlier. But time worked differently for people like her. It was always running out. Richard barely glanced at her as he walked in, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice filled the room with effortless authority. "No, tell them we'll close the deal only if they raise the offer by 10%. I don't care what the lawyers say. 10% or we walk." When he hung up, he noticed Maria still standing by the window and frowned as if her presence had offended the view. "Why are you here? This room was supposed to be ready an hour ago." "I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman," she said quickly. "I was just finishing. I'll be out of your way right now." "Make it fast," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively before turning to his guests. They filled the room with easy laughter, settling into their leather chairs like kings in a private court. Ethan Carter, the Texan oil magnate, poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "You always run this place like a damn fortress, Richard," he said with a grin. "Wouldn't surprise me if you had missile defense systems under this table." Richard smirked. "Close enough. I've got a safe right there." He gestured toward the gleaming Swisstech titanium unit near the corner. "Cost me $3 million, imported from Switzerland, laser-guided biometric encryption, military-grade stuff. Not even the Secret Service could crack it." The men whistled in admiration. Frank leaned forward, tapping the table. $3 million for a box that holds paper. "You rich bastards sure know how to spend money." Richard's grin widened. "It's not about what it holds, Frank. It's about what it represents: power, control, security. The knowledge that what's mine stays mine." That was when his eyes landed on Emily, sitting quietly on one of the far chairs, her small legs swinging slightly above the floor. She'd been drawing in her notebook, lost in her own world, but when she felt the weight of his gaze, she froze. "Who's that?" Richard asked, his tone curious but sharp. Maria turned, her stomach tightening. "My daughter, sir. My neighbor got sick. I didn't have anyone to watch her today. I'll take her right now, I promise." But Richard's smile stopped her. It wasn't kind. It was the kind of smile predators wear before they play with their food. No, let her stay, I'm curious." Maria hesitated. "Sir, please." "It's fine," he interrupted, turning to his friends. "Gentlemen, looks like we've got an audience. What do you say we give the kid a little economics lesson?" Laughter rippled around the table. Ethan chuckled. "As long as it doesn't involve me giving away money, I'm in." Richard walked over to the safe, placing his hand on its metallic surface like it was a beloved pet. "This beauty right here," he said, his voice smooth, "is the most secure private safe in the United States. Built with titanium composite, reinforced locking systems, and an algorithmic code that resets every hour." He turned to Emily, who was watching him carefully. "Tell me, sweetheart, do you think you could open it?" The men burst into laughter. Maria's heart nearly stopped. She could see what was happening. He was making her daughter the punchline of his joke. Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. "No, sir," she said softly. "Smart answer," Richard said, pacing in front of the safe like a showman. "But let's make this interesting." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his sleek black wallet. "Tell you what, if you can open this safe, I'll give you $100 million. Cash. That's right, $100 million. The men exploded with laughter. Ethan nearly spilled his drink. "You're insane, Coleman." $100 million. Richard shrugged theatrically. "Why not? It's impossible anyway." He turned back to Emily. "So what do you say, kid? You want to give it a try?" Maria stepped forward quickly, panic in her eyes. "Mr. Coleman, please. She's just a child. We'll leave now." Richard didn't even look at her. "I wasn't talking to you, Maria." He pointed at Emily. "I'm talking to her. Let the girl speak for herself." The room's energy shifted. The laughter grew louder, more mocking. Peter Lang pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is gold," he muttered. "Can't wait to show this at the club." Maria felt humiliation burning through her. Her hands trembled as she reached for Emily, but her daughter's small hand squeezed hers back. It was a simple gesture, but it stopped her. Emily's eyes were steady, calm, almost fearless. Richard leaned closer, crouching to meet Emily's gaze. "Do you know what $100 million even is?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Emily looked at him and nodded slowly. "It's a lot of money," she said. He chuckled. "More than a lot, it's more than your mom will ever see." More than you'll ever imagine. You know what I could buy with that island's jets? People's futures. He smirked. Money like that separates people like me from people like you. It's what makes the world work. Maria's chest ached as the words hit her. Every syllable was another slap. She wanted to yell, to beg him to stop, but her voice refused to come out. She had spent too many years swallowing pain to keep her job. The men were laughing again. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You were killing me, Richard. The poor woman's about to faint. Richard smiled at his audience, basking in their approval. He loved this, the feeling of dominance, the performance of superiority. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was a game. Then he looked back at Emily. So, little genius, what do you say? Want to try? Emily stared at the safe, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at him and said, Why are you offering money for something you know can't be done? The laughter faltered. Richard blinked. What did you say? You said no one can open it, she continued, her tone calm. So you're not really offering anything. You just want everyone to laugh at me and my mom. For the first time, Richard's face changed. The smirk slipped, replaced by something colder. His friends exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan gave a half-hearted laugh to break the tension, but it didn't land. Richard straightened his tie. You've got quite the mouth for a janitor's kid. Emily's gaze didn't waver. My dad used to say that people who brag the loudest about what they have are the ones who are most afraid to lose it. The words hit harder than any scream could have. For a second, the billionaire's practiced composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. Peter lowered his phone, no longer smiling. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, but no one spoke. Richard forced a laugh, trying to recover his authority. Cute, really cute. But let's not pretend philosophy can open a $3 million safe. He turned away, dismissing her with a wave, but something in his eyes betrayed him, a flash of uncertainty. Like a man who just glimpsed his reflection and didn't like what he saw. Maria pulled her daughter close, whispering, It's okay, baby. Let's go. But before they could move, Richard spoke again. Actually, he said, his tone sharper now, I'm curious. You said your dad used to talk about safes. Emily nodded. He designed them. That got everyone's attention. Even Ethan leaned forward. No kidding. The janitor's husband built safes like that. Maria's hands shook. Please, sir, that's enough. But Emily wasn't scared anymore. She looked straight at the billionaire and said quietly, My dad told me something about safes like yours. They don't protect what's inside. They protect what you're afraid to face. Richard froze, caught between anger and confusion. He wanted to laugh it off, to mock her again, but for the first time in his life, words failed him. For a moment, no one spoke. The laughter that had filled the boardroom minutes ago now hung in the air like smoke, heavy and awkward. Richard Coleman stood frozen beside his gleaming titanium safe, unsure whether to feel amused, annoyed, or challenged by the 11-year-old staring him down. Her words had hit something in him, something small but sharp that no one in this room had ever dared touch. You said your dad designed safes, he asked finally, his tone sharper than he intended. Emily nodded. Yes, sir. He worked on security systems for banks, government buildings, and corporate offices. He was an engineer. Richard arched an eyebrow. Was? Maria's breath caught. He passed away 2 years ago, she said softly, clutching her daughter's shoulder. There was an accident at his job. An uneasy quiet rippled through the room. Ethan Carter shifted in his chair, suddenly less comfortable. Mark Bradley cleared his throat, glancing at Richard as if silently suggesting he end the game. But Richard wasn't ready to stop. There was a strange flicker of interest in his eyes, part curiosity, part pride. An engineer, huh? He said, forcing a smile. So your father built things like this. He tapped the side of the safe, the metallic ring echoing off the walls. Emily nodded again. He didn't build this exact one, but he knew how they worked. He said people who bought expensive safes usually didn't need them. They bought them to feel powerful. Richard tilted his head. And what's wrong with wanting to feel powerful? Emily met his gaze. Because power isn't real if it depends on other people being small. The sentence landed like a punch. The investors exchanged glances, their earlier amusement replaced with something closer to discomfort. Ethan gave a low whistle. She's got a mouth. Richard reminds me of my ex-wife. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out stiff. He turned toward Maria, his smile brittle. You've been teaching your daughter some interesting ideas, Maria. Maria shook her head quickly. No, sir, she just remembers things her father used to say. Please, let's just go. But Emily didn't move. She stood tall beside her mother, her small hands clenched into fists. My dad taught me that every lock has a weakness, she said. Not because the design is bad, but because the person who builds it thinks they're smarter than everyone else. And people who think they're smarter than everyone else always make mistakes. Richard's jaw tightened. The words stung more than he wanted to admit. So what are you saying, Emily? That you could open my safe? The men chuckled again, relieved by the return of mockery, but their laughter sounded thinner now, uneasy. Emily didn't smile. "I'm saying I know how it works," she said simply. Ethan leaned back. "Oh, come on, the kid's bluffing. She's, what, in middle school?" Emily ignored him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Richard. "You said your safe uses an algorithmic code that resets every hour," she said, her voice steady. "But those systems still have a master code, a factory setting that's supposed to be changed after installation. Most people don't bother." Peter Lang frowned. "How would you even know that?" "My dad told me," Emily replied. "He said 80% of clients never change the master code. They just add more layers of security and think they're safe. But it doesn't matter how many locks you add if you forget to change the first one." A cold silence followed her words. Richard's smile flickered again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. He felt a twitch of irritation under his collar. "That's a nice story, kid," he said. "But this is a Swisstick Titanium X900. You can't just guess a code. It's designed to stop hackers, military-grade encryption." Emily took a small step closer to the safe. "Then why do you still use the original master sequence, Mr. Coleman?" The question landed like thunder. Ethan blinked. What did she say? Richard felt his stomach twist. "What are you talking about?" Emily pointed to the bottom corner of the safe. "Swisstick safes have a production serial number engraved there. My dad said the factory master code is based on that number reversed, with the last digit multiplied by 3. It's simple if you know how they were programmed." Maria's hand flew to her mouth. "Emily, stop," she whispered, terrified of what her daughter was saying. But Emily's expression didn't change. Her voice stayed calm, matter of fact, as if she were explaining a science project. "The C47880, she continued. "Reverse, that's 087174, multiply the last digit 0 by 3, still 0. Drop the first number and take the middle 5 digits. She looked directly at Richard. "Your code is 17847. The room went still. Richard froze. The color drained from his face. His friends stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say she was wrong, but he didn't. His mind was racing. He hadn't changed the factory master code, not once. He'd meant to years ago when the safe was installed, but he'd never bothered. Why would he? He trusted the biometric lock, the retina scanner, the voice key. The default code was just a backup, a detail beneath his concern. Ethan broke the silence first. "Wait, is that really?" Richard forced a chuckle, but it sounded hollow. "Coincidence," he said, his voice thin. "She's guessing." Emily asked softly. Peter stood and walked toward the safe, kneeling to check the engraving at the base. "Holy hell," he muttered. "She's right. That's the serial number." Richard's pulse quickened. He could feel everyone's eyes on him now, not with admiration but disbelief. The girl he'd mocked 5 minutes ago had just peeled back the illusion he'd built his entire persona on. Maria looked horrified. "Emily, please," she said again, but Emily's expression had softened now. She wasn't trying to humiliate him. She was explaining something true. "My dad said safes aren't about protecting money," she said quietly. "They're about protecting people's fear. When someone spends millions on something like this, it's not because they need security. It's because they need to feel safe from their own doubt." The men sat frozen, unsure what to do. Even Ethan's cocky grin had disappeared. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. All his practiced arrogance, his commanding presence, the dominance that made people fear him, it had evaporated in front of a barefoot 11-year-old. He turned toward the window, trying to collect himself, but all he could see was the reflection of a man who suddenly looked small. For years, Richard Coleman had believed power meant control over money, over people, over outcomes. But this child, this daughter of a janitor, had just shown him that control was an illusion. The realization tasted bitter, like medicine swallowed too late. Ethan finally stood, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, damn," he said with a nervous laugh. "Looks like the little lady just hacked your ego, Richard." Nobody laughed. Richard's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "How did you know the question of security?" Emily tilted her head. "Because I know how people think. You used your first car as your security question, didn't you?" He blinked, startled. "What?" "My dad said rich people always use things they own for passwords, cars, watches, vacation houses, because those are the things they care about. You probably used your first Corvette, the one you bragged about on TV 2 years ago." Ethan looked at Richard, eyes wide. "Tell me that's not true." Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone could see the truth written all over his face. Emily stepped back from the safe and took her mother's hand again. "My dad said the best security doesn't come from machines. It comes from knowing what really matters." The words lingered in the air long after she'd said them. For the first time in his life, Richard Coleman had nothing to say, no comeback, no justification. The girl he'd mocked had dismantled him piece by piece, not by shouting, but by being right. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath the anger and the pride, something began to crack. Richard Coleman stood frozen beside his safe, every trace of his smug grin erased. The titanium surface behind him gleamed under the boardroom lights, no longer a symbol of power but of exposure. The little girl in the oversized yellow sweater had dismantled the illusion he'd spent his life building, and she had done it with calm precision, without raising her voice once. The other men sat speechless, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others staring at Richard with the uneasy realization that his humiliation had just become theirs too. Maria stood behind her daughter, trembling. Her mind screamed at her to grab Emily and leave, to escape before this man's anger exploded. But Emily's presence, so small, so still, held the entire room captive. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and steady. "You asked if I could open your safe, Mr. Coleman," she said. "I could, but I won't." Richard's head snapped toward her. "You won't." His tone was strained, like a man trying to pretend he wasn't losing control. Emily shook her head. "If I open it, you'll just say I cheated, or that I got lucky. Or maybe you will change the rules like people do when they realize they can lose." Ethan Carter let out a nervous laugh. "Kids got you pegged, Richard." Richard shot him a glare, then looked back at Emily. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Emily didn't flinch. "No, sir. I just know how people like you think." The simplicity of her tone stung more than any insult. For the first time in his life, Richard Coleman felt something he didn't recognize: shame. The silence in the room was thick with it, an invisible fog settling over the leather chairs and marble floor. Emily took a slow breath and continued, her words deliberate. "You offered me $100 million because you thought I couldn't win. But it wasn't about the money. You wanted to prove that someone like me would always be small next to someone like you." She paused. "The thing is, you were wrong." Maria closed her eyes, her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She could barely process what was happening. Her child, standing toe to toe with billionaires and dismantling them piece by piece. Not with anger but with truth. Richard forced a smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You talk big for someone who has nothing." Emily looked up at him. "Maybe that's why you were scared of me." The words hit him like a slap. Behind him, Ethan muttered under his breath, "Jesus, Richard, maybe call it a day before the kid runs your company too." Richard ignored him. "So what do you want then?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "You think you've won? Fine. You've embarrassed me. Congratulations. You can't buy your way out of being poor with clever words." Emily glanced at her mother, then back at him. "I don't want your money," she said, "but I want 3 things. The men exchanged puzzled glances. Even Maria looked confused. "Emily, honey." Her daughter raised a small hand. "It's okay, Mom." Then, turning to Richard, she continued, "First, I want my mom to have a real job here, not cleaning floors. She used to be a teacher. She's smart, patient, and kind. You could use someone like her." Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Emily, no." But Emily didn't stop. Her voice was growing stronger, steadier, carried by something fierce and pure. "Second, I want you and your friends to start a scholarship program for kids like me, the children of people who work here. Not charity, not a photo opportunity, but something real. Something that gives kids a chance to learn, to become more than what the world expects from them." The men shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. Peter Lang whispered, "This is getting ridiculous," but nobody dared laugh. Emily's gaze swept across the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "And third," she said, "I want you to change the code on your safe. Because now I know it, and if an 11-year-old can figure it out, you're not as safe as you think." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Richard stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his pride crushed beneath the weight of the truth. "You were giving me orders now?" he asked quietly, though his voice had lost its edge. "I'm giving you a choice," Emily said. "You can keep pretending your money makes you better, or you can start acting like a man my dad would be respected." For the first time, the mention of her father didn't make Maria flinch. It filled the room with something powerful and human. The men could feel it too. Ethan Carter, who had spent his life chasing oil and women, cleared his throat and looked away, ashamed. Richard leaned back against the edge of the table. His reflection in the glass wall behind him looked different now, older, smaller, maybe even broken. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to run my life?" Emily looked down at the floor, then back up. "You walked into my life first." That stopped him cold. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every person he'd ever stepped on to climb higher. Maria finally found her voice, whispering, "Please, Mr. Coleman. We don't want trouble, we just want to leave." Richard didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on Emily, as if he were seeing her for the first time. She wasn't just a child anymore, she was a mirror reflecting everything he hated about himself. At last he straightened and exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, almost to himself, "let's say I agree. Let's say I give your mom a job and set up your scholarship. What makes you think it'll change anything?" Emily tilted her head. "Because someone has to start." Her tone was calm, not defiant, just factual, and somehow that made it more powerful. Ethan let out a slow whistle. Kid's right. Hell, if we'd started something like that years ago, maybe we wouldn't need so many guards at our gates. Peter shot him a look, but even he couldn't deny the truth. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of something unfamiliar pressing down on him. Accountability. For years he had lived in a world where he was untouchable. Every mistake could be covered with money, every moral crack sealed with luxury. But this was different. This wasn't a board meeting. It was a reckoning. He looked at Maria, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief and fear. You were a teacher, he asked quietly. She nodded hesitantly. Yes, sir, before my husband died. He nodded slowly, thinking. We have a new training program starting next month, he said, employee development. We need someone who can communicate with staff. His gaze softened just a little. Would you be interested? Maria blinked, tears filling her eyes. Are you serious? Richard's voice was low. I've never been more serious in my life. Ethan chuckled softly. Well, I'll be damned, the girl's turning you human, Richard. Richard ignored the comment. He turned back to Emily and the scholarship fund. She smiled faintly, the first real smile since the meeting began. You'll call it the David Johnson Foundation, she said. After my dad. Something in Richard's chest tightened. He gave a small nod. All right, he said. You've got a deal. Emily stepped forward and held out her small hand. Her gesture was simple, but it carried more power than any contract he'd ever signed. For a moment, Richard hesitated, then he took her hand. Her grip was steady, unafraid. Deal, she said quietly. When she and her mother turned to leave, the men in the room stayed seated, unable to speak. The sound of their footsteps across the marble floor echoed like judgment. Richard watched them go, his hand still tingling from the handshake. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a man who had just been given a second chance, and he wasn't sure he deserved it. He turned toward the safe, its metallic sheen mocking him. The same safe he had once used to symbolize control now stared back at him like a monument to everything he'd gotten wrong. Ethan rose slowly and clapped him on the shoulder. You know, Richard, he said, half smiling, you just got taught $1 billion lesson for free. Richard didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the safe as the words of an 11-year-old echoed through his mind. Change the code. He reached out and pressed his hand against the cold metal surface. For the first time in his life, it didn't feel like security. It felt like a mirror. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. It began as a short clip on social media, shaky cell phone footage recorded by Peter Lang, the pharmaceutical here who couldn't resist filming what he thought would be a harmless joke. He had uploaded it privately to a group chat that night with the caption Coleman humiliates a janitor's kid, hilarious. Someone in that chat leaked it. Within hours, the video was everywhere. It opened with the sound of ladder echoing off marble walls, then Richard's voice, smooth and smug, offering a barefoot girl $100 million if she could open his safe. The camera panned to Emily, small, calm, her big brown eyes looking straight at him. Then came her question, sharp and clear. If you know it can't be opened, then you're not really offering anything, are you? The laughter stopped on cue. The video ended on Richard's stunned expression. By sunrise, the clip had over 12 million views on TikTok. By noon, every major news outlet had picked it up. The headlines varied, but the story was the same: billionaire humiliates janitor's daughter, gets destroyed by her intelligence. Cable talk shows replayed the clip between segments about politics and the economy. Pundits called it the slap of reality the rich needed. Morning hosts joked about the Coleman challenge. Late-night comedians made him the punchline of the week. Richard Coleman, once untouchable, became the internet's new villain. His company's PR department went into panic mode before lunch. By early afternoon, reporters were camping outside the Coleman Tower lobby, shoving microphones at every employee who walked out. Investors called nonstop, demanding statements, explanations, anything to calm the storm. His assistant, trembling, informed him that the board wanted an emergency meeting. They were worried about stock prices, she said. We've lost 4% in one day. Richard sat in his office, blinds drawn, staring at the muted television across from his desk. The screen showed his own face in split screen next to a headline that read arrogance on display, billionaire's cruel bet goes viral. He'd watched the video 10 times already, searching for a version that didn't make him look like a monster. But no matter how many times he replayed it, he couldn't escape the truth. He had looked like a monster. His phone buzzed again, another text from Ethan Carter. Told you not to joke with cameras around. You're retrending worse than a scandal. Richard didn't reply. He tossed the phone onto his desk, buried his face in his hands, and tried to remember the exact moment everything had gone wrong. It wasn't the video that ruined him, it was the mirror it held up. Every arrogant word, every mocking laugh, every smirk, it was all him. unfiltered. For decades he had believed his image was untouchable. He had bought politicians, charities, even a museum wing in his own name. But now the world saw him for what he really was, a man who used power like a weapon and called it confidence. Across town, Maria Johnson sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, holding her daughter close as their faces appeared on a TV for the third time that day. The news anchor's voice was calm and professional, but the story burned all the same. A janitor and her daughter are at the center of a viral scandal exposing the cruelty of corporate America. The camera froze on a frame of Emily looking up at Richard, unafraid. Maria didn't know whether to cry or smile. "You shouldn't have said those things to him," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. Emily rested her head on her mother's shoulder. He needed to hear them. Maria let out a shaky laugh. "You have no idea what you've started." But Emily did. She could see it in the flood of messages on her mom's old phone. Strangers from all over the country had written to them, teachers, single parents, Jana's waitresses, even CEOs. "Your daughter is a hero. She gave my kid hope. Tell her thank you for speaking up." For the first time in her life, Maria didn't feel invisible. Back in the Coleman Tower, chaos ruled. Employees whispered in elevators. Some said Maria and Emily had been fired. Others said the company had offered them money to stay quiet. Her was scrambling to draft statements about commitment to integrity and re-examining corporate values. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Richard hadn't spoken publicly yet. His lawyers advised silence until the backlash cooled, but silence only made it worse. Without his voice, the internet filled in the blanks. Memes of him standing beside the safe flooded Twitter. One showed him with the caption, "Rich enough to buy everything, smart enough to lose to a fifth grader." Another showed Emily with the line, "She cracked more than is safe." By the third day, protesters had gathered outside Coleman Tower holding signs that read, "Respect workers, justice for Maria, and dignity can't be bought." What had begun as outrage turned into a movement. People weren't just angry about one man's arrogance anymore, they were angry about what it represented. The internet had turned Emily into a symbol. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, the city glowing beneath him. He'd built this life brick by brick, deal by deal, convincing himself he was untouchable. Now the lights below looked different, colder somehow, like the city had finally turned its back on him. On the table beside him sat a folder his legal team had prepared. It contained non-disclosure agreements, settlement proposals, and pre-drafted apologies written by publicists who specialized in reputation damage. The plan was simple: pay off Maria Johnson, rebrand the story as a misunderstanding, and donate a few million to charity for good measure. It was the usual playbook. It had always worked before. But when he picked up the pen, his hand froze. The image of Emily standing in front of the safe flashed through his mind, her steady eyes, her calm voice, the way she had said, "Power isn't real if it depends on other people being small." The words echoed in his head like a verdict. He dropped the pen. For the first time in years, Richard felt something break inside him. It wasn't anger or fear. It was realization, the cold, undeniable truth that everything he'd built had been for the wrong reasons. The next morning, he showed up at the office before anyone else. The building felt different, emptier, heavier. He walked through the marble lobby, past the gold-trimmed elevator doors, to the boardroom where it had all begun. The air still carried the faint scent of expensive cologne and humiliation. He stood before the titanium safe, his reflection warped in its surface. The faint number 4070 glinted near the bottom corner, mocking him. Slowly he entered the master code as 71847. The lock clicked open. Inside were stacks of documents, bonds, and a small velvet box containing a diamond watch he'd bought himself after hitting his first billion. He stared at the contents for a long time, then closed the door and locked it again. That afternoon, he called an emergency press conference. His advisors begged him not to do. "You'll make it worse," they warned. "Wait a few days." But Richard had waited long enough. When he stepped up the podium, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Coleman, do you regret what you said? Have you spoken to the Johnson family? Are you resigning?" He took a deep breath. "Yes," he said simply. "I regret everything." The room went silent. He continued, his voice steady but heavy. "What happened in that boardroom was more than a mistake, it was a mirror. I saw what money had turned me into. I saw what I'd lost. That little girl wasn't trying to embarrass me. She was trying to remind me of what I forgot to respect." He paused, glancing at the cameras. "From this moment forward, the Coleman Group will create a $100 million education trust for the children of our employees. It will be called the David Johnson Foundation, and Maria Johnson will lead it." Gasps rippled through the press room. Richard looked down at his prepared notes, then set them aside. "You can write whatever headlines you want," he said quietly. "But this isn't about damage control, it's about redemption." When the conference ended, The reporters swarmed him with more questions, but he walked past them without answering. Outside the building, the protesters had fallen silent, their signs slowly lowering as they watched him step into his car. For the first time in decades, Richard Coleman didn't feel like running from the noise. He felt like listening. The next 24 hours were unlike anything New York had seen in years. The same media that had crucified Richard Coleman was now replaying his apology across every network, dissecting every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion. For the first time in a long time, a billionaire's statement didn't sound rehearsed, it sounded human. The world didn't know what to do with that. Cable commentators who had mocked him days earlier now argued about whether his remorse was real. Some called it the greatest press stunt of the decade. Others said it was the beginning of a moral awakening in corporate America. Online people were divided. Coleman redemption trended alongside a Tula Terrici. But amidst the noise, one clip rose above the rest, the moment when he had said, "That little girl wasn't trying to embarrass me. She was trying to remind me of what I forgot: respect." Maria Johnson had watched the press conference from her kitchen, her hands trembling as she clutched an old coffee mug. The TV screen flickered with the image of the man who had humiliated her and her daughter, now speaking like someone she barely recognized. Emily sat beside her, knees drawn to her chest, watching quietly. When Richard mentioned her father's name, the David Johnson Foundation, Maria gasped so hard she almost dropped the mug. She turned to Emily, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded slowly. "He kept his promise." Maria shook her head in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why would he do that?" "Because he meant it," Emily said softly. "People can change." Maria wanted to believe her, but years of disappointment had taught her otherwise. She had seen men like Richard before, men who made grand gestures only when the cameras were on. Still, there was something in his voice that had sounded different. Not the slick tone of a CEO. Not the arrogance of a man defending his empire. It had sounded like someone who'd finally looked in the mirror and didn't like what he saw. Later that afternoon, a black car pulled up in front of their small Bronx apartment. Maria tensed, expecting the worst. A woman stepped out, sharply dressed but kind-eyed, carrying a briefcase. She introduced herself as Claire Rivera, Coleman Group's new head of community relations. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, extending her hand. "Coleman asked me to deliver this personally." Inside the envelope was a formal letter signed by Richard himself. It wasn't typed by an assistant. The handwriting was neat but deliberate, like someone trying to make every word count. "Dear Mrs. Johnson, I don't expect forgiveness, but I do owe you the truth. The world saw my worst moment, and I've spent every day since trying to understand how I became that man. Your daughter didn't just challenge me, she saved me from myself. The David Johnson Foundation will not be a publicity stunt. It will be a permanent institution, fully funded and operated independently from my company. I would be honored if you agreed to oversee its educational initiatives, not as a gesture of charity, but because you deserve to lead. Respectfully, Richard Coleman." Maria read it twice, tears welling in her eyes. She passed it to Emily, who smiled faintly after reading it. "He's really doing it," she whispered. Claire continued, "Mr. Coleman also asked me to arrange transportation for both of you to the Coleman Tower tomorrow morning. He'd like to meet in person, away from cameras." Mary hesitated. "Why, so he can apologize again?" Claire shook her head. "No, so he can listen." The next morning, the mother and daughter returned to the place where it had all begun. The lobby looked different this time, not because of any renovation, but because everyone who worked there looked at them differently. Security guards nodded respectfully, receptionists smiled. A few employees whispered, "That's them," as they walked by, not with mockery but admiration. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Richard was waiting. Gone was the expensive suit and the perfectly styled hair. He wore a simple gray blazer, no tie, no arrogance. The man who had once filled every room with noise now stood quietly, hands folded, eyes soft. "Mrs. Johnson, Emily," he said, his voice steady but humble, "thank you for coming." Maria's instinct was to stay guarded. She crossed her arms. "You humiliated us in front of your friends. Now you want to make it right because the world saw it." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, and because the world should have seen it." Emily stepped forward, studying him. "You really started the foundation." He smiled faintly. "Not just started, it's already funded $100 million. The paperwork was signed this morning." He motioned toward a set of folders on the table. "And I meant what I wrote. I want your mother to run the education program." Maria's eyes widened. I don't have a degree in business. I'm just..." "You re a teacher," he interrupted gently, "and a mother. You understand what children like Emily need better than any executive in this building." For a moment, Maria couldn't speak. Her throat tightened as she remembered the years she'd spent scrubbing these floors, invisible to everyone who walked over them. Now the same man who once mocked her was offering her a seat at the table. She took a deep breath. "If I say yes, this can't just be about your reputation," she said firmly. "This has to be about change, real change." Richard nodded. "Then let's make it that." That afternoon they sat together for hours, sketching out plans for the foundation scholarships, mentorship programs, partnerships with schools across the city. For the first time, the boardroom that had been a stage for humiliation became a place of rebuilding. News of the meeting spread quickly. When reporters caught wind of Maria's new role, the internet erupted again, this time with admiration. Photos of her shaking hands with Richard filled headlines. From janitor to director, Maria Johnson leads new education initiative. Emily's picture appeared beside hers, smiling shyly, her name now synonymous with courage. Still, not everyone believed in Richard's transformation. Commentators questioned his motives. Stockholders grumbled about wasting corporate assets. Old friends from his elite circles called him privately, warning him that philanthropy wouldn't erase what he'd done. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in decades, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. One evening, a week after the announcement, he received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Emily. "Dear Mr. Coleman, my mom says grown-ups don't change overnight, but I think maybe they can if they want to. I saw how you looked when you opened that safe. My dad used to look like that too, like he was trying to fix something only he could see. Thank you for keeping your promise. I hope you don't just build something big. I hope you build something good." Richard read the letter 3 times before setting it on his desk. He didn't frame it, didn't display it. He kept it in the drawer beside his watch, where he could see it every morning before work. In the months that followed, the David Johnson Foundation became a force of change. Hundreds of children from working-class families applied for scholarships. Former janitors, cafeteria workers, and security guards sent their kids to college for the first time. Maria ran the program with quiet strength, refusing interviews, focusing instead on results. Emily, now hailed as the girl who cracked the billionaire's heart, gave speeches at schools about empathy and courage. As for Richard, he kept his promise to stay out of the spotlight. He turned down the offers and magazine profiles. When people asked him why, he would simply say, "Because the story isn't about me anymore." But every so often, when he walked past the titanium safe in his office, he would run his hand along the cold surface and think of that day, the laughter, the challenge, the little girl who had seen straight through him. And he would smile, not with pride but with gratitude. Because in the end, she hadn't just opened a safe, she had unlocked something far more valuable. The months that followed the launch of the David Johnson Foundation felt like watching a stone dropped into water. The ripples just kept spreading. What started as an act of redemption inside one Manhattan skyscraper began to shift conversations far beyond its walls. The Foundation's first initiative, the Scholarship for Working Families, went live in April. Within a week, more than 10,000 applications poured in from every corner of the country. Cafeteria workers from Kansas, janitors from Detroit, bus drivers from Chicago, and housekeepers from Miami all wrote letters describing their dreams for their children, dreams they'd kept hidden for years because they'd never seemed possible. Maria Johnson read every one of them. She insisted on it. Every night, after Emily went to bed, she sat at her kitchen table in the Bronx with stacks of envelopes and a cup of coffee, reading stories that broke her heart and mended it at the same time. Some made her cry, some made her laugh. One letter came from a single father in Ohio who worked 3 jobs to put his daughter through school. "I never believed people like us mattered," he wrote, "but your story made me think maybe we do." Maria folded that letter carefully and kept it in her purse. It reminded her why she had said yes. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman threw himself into the work with a kind of obsession he hadn't felt since his early career, but this time, the obsession wasn't with profits or prestige. It was with purpose. He spent less time in corner offices and more in classrooms. He visited schools in low-income neighborhoods, standing at the back of auditoriums while teachers introduced him to students who'd watched Emily's video in ethics class. He rarely spoke at these visits, he just listened. The press loved to photograph him there, but he always made sure the captions didn't include his name. "Photograph the kids," he told them. They read the story. Emily became something of a local celebrity, though she didn't act like one. News outlets invited her to appear on talk shows, magazines wanted her on their covers, but she politely declined most of them. When her teachers asked her to give a speech at her middle school's graduation, she agreed only if her classmates could stand with her. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was everyone who's ever been told they were too small to make a difference." Her speech went viral again, this time for all the right reasons. But not everyone was happy. Inside the corporate world, Richard's transformation was seen as weakness. Old associates whispered that he'd lost his edge. Investors called his new philanthropic focus a distraction. One of his board members even accused him of turning Coleman Group into a charity experiment. Richard didn't argue. He simply said, maybe it's time business starts giving something back. When profits dipped slightly that quarter, critics pounced. The media that had once praised his apology now questioned whether he had gone soft. A headline in the Financial Tribune read, "The price of redemption has Coleman's conscience cost him his empire." He ignored it, but late at night, alone in his apartment, he couldn't deny the fear creeping back in. He wondered if he was really changing, or if he was just chasing forgiveness he'd never earn. One evening, Maria noticed the same doubt in his eyes during a meeting. They were reviewing the first scholarship selections at the foundation's small downtown office. "You're still thinking like the man you used to be," she said gently. He frowned, meaning, "You keep measuring success in numbers, how many people applied, how much money was spent, how much press coverage we got. That's not the point. This isn't a business deal. It's a promise." Her words hit him harder than she realized. For the rest of the evening, he barely spoke. When the meeting ended, he walked out onto the street and stood there for a long time, watching traffic flow past the glowing skyline. For years, he'd thought achievement was measured in balance sheets and buildings. Now it was measured in lives. And that was a kind of math he still didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, Emily's life changed quietly. She didn't move to a fancy neighborhood or start wearing expensive clothes. She stayed in the same school, the same apartment, with the same cracked paint on the walls. But something had shifted inside her too. Teachers listened when she spoke, friends looked up to her. Strangers recognized her on the subway, smiling and saying, "You re the girl from the video." She'd nod politely, but what she loved most was when people told her how her words had changed them. One woman who worked as a cleaner in a hospital stopped her one day and said, "My daughter applied for your foundation. She wants to be a nurse. Thank you for giving her hope." Emily hugged her without saying a word. Back at the Coleman Tower, change wasn't just happening in the foundation. It was seeping into the company itself. Richard ordered a review of every employee's pay structure and benefits. He created a mentorship program pairing executives with maintenance staff, encouraging empathy and communication. The move shocked the business community but inspired thousands online. Coleman effect became a trending term for CEOs who followed his lead, pledging portions of profits to employee education funds. But with the praise came pressure. Every move he made was watched, judged, dissected. When one of his former partners accused him of hypocrisy, claiming he'd laid off hundreds during an earlier merger, old ghosts resurfaced. Headlines once again painted him as a fraud trying to wash away his sins with money. For a week, he almost believed them. Then one morning, as he entered the foundation's office, he saw Emily sitting in the lobby reading a book. She looked up, smiled, and said, "Morning, Mr. Coleman." He smiled back, wary but sincere. "Morning, Emily. Shouldn't you be in school?" "It's Saturday," she said. "Mom's doing interviews for the scholarship winners." He nodded and sat across from her. For a while they said nothing. Then Emily closed her book and asked, "Why do you look sad?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Because people don't always believe I've changed, and maybe they rewrite." Emily tilted her head. "My dad used to say you don't fix things by believing you re-good. You fix them by doing good, even when no one's watching." Richard smiled faintly. "Sounds like your father was a smart man." "He was," she said softly, "and you relearning." That simple sentence stayed with him for days. A month later, the first recipients of the David Johnson scholarships were announced in a small ceremony held in a public high school auditorium in Brooklyn. Maria stood on stage beside Richard as she called the names of students whose lives were about to change. Some wore secondhand suits, some wore sneakers and hoodies, but all of them wore hope like a badge. When Emily stepped up to present the final scholarship, the crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, but this time Richard didn't feel like he was performing. He felt like he was part of something real. That night, after everyone left, Richard stayed behind in the empty auditorium. The chairs were still warm from the crowd, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and excitement. He walked to the podium and looked out over the rows of seats. This time, there was no audience, no spotlight, just him. He thought of the man he used to be, the one who measured worth in money and mocked the poor to feel strong. That man had built empires and broken people, but the man standing here now didn't crave applause. He craved peace. As he left the building, he passed by the school janitor mopping the hallway floor. The man paused and nodded politely. Rich stopped, reached out, and took the mop from his hands. "Go home," he said. "Have you got this one?" The janitor blinked, startled. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know," Richard said and smiled, "but maybe I should." He mopped in silence for a few minutes, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't about guilt or spectacle, it was about understanding. Every swipe of the mop felt like another step towards something he'd never known before, humility. When he walked out into the cool night air, he looked up at the stars scattered above New York City and whispered to himself, "Change the code." It wasn't just about the safe anymore. It was about rewriting his life. By late summer, the David Johnson Foundation had become more than an organization. It was a conversation starter. Across the country, people were debating what it meant for a billionaire to change his ways, and whether real change was even possible. Talk shows, podcasts, and op-eds dissected every move Richard Coleman made, some calling him a visionary, others a traitor to his class. For the first time, the rich weren't united. There were fractures in the marble walls of wealth, and those cracks had a name: Emily Johnson. Richard didn't expect redemption to come easy, but he also hadn't anticipated the depth of hostility from his old circles. Invitations to high society events stopped arriving. Business partners who once fought for meetings with him now ghosted his calls. At private country clubs, whispers followed him like a shadow. Words like sellout and bleeding heart drifted through conversations as he walked by. To them, his transformation wasn't noble, it was betrayal. One night, at a charity gala he couldn't avoid, Richard stood near the edge of the ballroom, listening to the familiar hum of polite laughter and shallow conversations. The chandeliers glittered like constellations above polished champagne flutes. A man he'd known for years, Preston Hale, a hedge fund titan, approached him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So how's life as America's favorite saint?" Preston said, swirling his drink. Richard sighed, trying to make up for lost time. Preston smirked. "Don't fool yourself, old friend. You can't buy redemption. You're just trading guilt for good press. The rest of us still play the real game." Richard looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Maybe the real game was broken all along." Preston chuckled. "That's what people say right before they go broke." That night when Richard returned home, the echo of those words stayed with him. He poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey, and stood by the window overlooking the city. Once, that skyline had felt like his trophy. Now it looked like a challenge, a constant reminder that for every success story he'd built, there were thousands he'd ignored. Meanwhile, the foundation was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. Maria's leadership gave it heart, and Emily's story gave it soul. Local chapters began forming in other states. Volunteers, teachers, and small business owners who wanted to replicate the idea in their communities. The foundation's mission statement, "Education is not charity, it's justice," became a rallying cry across social media. Emily, now 12, had unintentionally become a symbol. Her face appeared on classroom posters beside quotes about courage and empathy. Schools invited her to speak, but she only accepted one invitation: a middle school in Brooklyn not far from where her father used to work. Standing in front of hundreds of kids her age, she didn't talk about fame or money. She talked about her dad, her mom, and the day she realized even the smallest voice could make a giant listen. "My dad used to fix locks," she told them. He said the best ones weren't the hardest to open, they were the ones people didn't even try to break, because they believed they couldn't. Sometimes people like that too, they think they can't change things. But you can, you just have to try. The crowd went silent, hanging on her every word. Then came applause that shook the gymnasium. Reporters later called it the moment the movement found its heart. But while the world was falling in love with Emily's message, the pressure on Richard intensified. Several investors withdrew their stakes from Coleman Group, citing philosophical differences. Stockholders filed complaints about the company's new community-focused policies, calling them financially irresponsible. The board summoned him for a closed meeting, their tone no longer respectful but cold and strategic. "We didn't sign up for charity," one of them said bluntly. "You're returning this company into a social experiment. Our job is to make money, not moral statements." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhausted but defiant. "And what's the point of money if it doesn't mean anything?" Another board member, a silver-haired lawyer, frowned. "Meaning doesn't pay dividends. Neither does greed," Richard replied quietly. After the meeting, rumors spread that the board might vote to remove him as CEO. When the news broke, the internet exploded again, half cheering him as a martyr for change, half predicting his downfall. Maria called him that evening, her voice calm but concerned. "You knew this would happen," she said. "I did," he admitted. "I just didn't think it would hurt this much." "Change always hurts," she said softly. "But if it didn't, it wouldn't be real." Her words steadied him. The following week he held a press conference not to defend himself, but to clarify his purpose. Standing before dozens of cameras, he said, "I'm not trying to be a saint. I'm trying to be useful. If that costs me my title, so be it." The room fell quiet, journalists exchanging surprised looks. It wasn't the speech of a businessman fighting for power, it was the confession of a man who'd finally stopped chasing it. Meanwhile, the foundation's work began to produce tangible results. The first wave of scholarship recipients enrolled in colleges across the country. A teenage boy from the Bronx became the first in his family to attend MIT. A girl from Louisiana wrote an essay that won national awards inspired by Emily's story. Communities started hosting Unlocking Potential events, where people shared stories of how education had changed their lives. Each one ended with the same phrase projected on a wall: change the code. That phrase became something of a cultural phenomenon. People used it in ways even Emily hadn't expected. Activists used it to talk about reforming broken systems. Teachers used it to encourage students. Even corporations began using it in their ethics campaigns, though Richard refused to trademark it. It doesn't belong to me, he told Maria. It belongs to everyone who believes they can be better. Still, the higher the movement rose, the more it tested the people at its center. Reporters began digging into Maria's past, questioning her credentials and implying she'd only gotten her position because of pity. Trolls online spread lies about Emily, twisting her story into clickbait headlines. One evening, as Maria scrolled through hateful comments, her hands shook with rage. "They don't even know us," she muttered. Emily looked up from her homework. "Then let's not waste time on people who don't want to understand." Maria smiled sadly. "You sound more like your dad every day." Richard saw the same comments. His priest-hair team urged him to issue a statement defending them, but he refused. "Words won't fix ignorance," he said. Instead, he doubled down on the foundation's work, funding more schools, expanding mentorships, and inviting critics to visit their programs firsthand. Some came expecting to find a publicity stunt. They left in tears. By winter, something unexpected began to happen. Other billionaires, ones who had publicly mocked months earlier, started launching their own philanthropic initiatives. None admitted to being inspired by Richard, but the influence was obvious. A tech mogul in California donated half his fortune to teacher training. A real estate magnate in Texas built housing for employees. Change was catching on, and though slow, it was real. Richard watched it unfold from a distance. He didn't take credit. He didn't give interviews. He just smiled when Maria showed him headlines and said quietly, "The world's learning to change its code." One evening, Emily stopped by his office after school carrying a small wooden box. "This was my dad's," she said, placing it on his desk. Inside was a tiny brass lock, scratched and old, with a key attached by string. He used to say, "Every lock has a story." "I think this one's yours now." Richard picked up the lock, feeling its weight in his hand. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. Emily smiled. "Maybe not yet, but you retrying." He looked at her and nodded. "Then I'll keep trying." As she left his office, he turned the brass lock over in his hand and saw a small engraving at the bottom: DJ's 01. It hit him then. David Johnson, the man whose daughter had opened his eyes. He placed the lock beside his computer, where he would see it every morning as a reminder of how far he'd come, and how much further there was to go. Because redemption wasn't a destination, it was a practice, a daily act of rewriting the code. The first real test of Richard Coleman's transformation came almost exactly 1 year after the day everything changed. The David Johnson Foundation had grown faster than anyone expected, too fast. New chapters were opening across the country, new donations flooding in, new programs launching weekly. The press hailed it as the most successful philanthropic initiative of the decade. But beneath the headlines and hopeful numbers, cracks had begun to form. It started small. A discrepancy in the foundation's financial records. Maria noticed it first. During a routine audit, she found that a series of transfers from the central account didn't match the budget. At first, she assumed it was a clerical mistake, but as she dug deeper, the missing funds added up to millions. When she showed the documents to Claire Rivera, the head of community relations, the woman's face went pale. "This can't be right," Claire whispered. "That money was supposed to go to the scholarship expansion." Within hours, they discovered the truth. A senior financial officer, Thomas Gray, had been embezzling funds and redirecting them into shell accounts overseas. Worse, Gray wasn't acting alone. He'd been hired by one of Richard's oldest business partners, Preston Hale, the same man who'd mocked him at the gala months earlier. The plan was simple but ruthless: create a scandal big enough to destroy the foundation's credibility, forcing Richard out of power and restoring his fall from grace. When Maria brought the findings to Richard, she found him standing by his office window. The same spot where he had once looked down on the city as if it were his kingdom. The skyline still glowed, but it didn't look the same anymore. "How much?" he asked quietly. "6 million so far," Maria said. "Maybe more. If this goes public, it could kill everything we've built." Richard turned from the window, his face hardening in a way Maria hadn't seen in months. It was the look of the old Richard, the one who used to crush problems with money and power. "Then it doesn't go public," he said. "We'll fix it internally, cover the loss, and move on." Maria frowned. "You can't just hide it. That's what the old you would be done." He snapped. "The old me knew how to protect what mattered." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Maria stared at him, eyes full of disappointment. After a long silence, he ran a hand through his hair and muttered, "I'm sorry, you're right. It's just this foundation isn't just a project to me, it's redemption. If this falls apart, people will say I never changed." Maria's voice softened, "Then show them that you have." He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "Call the board," he said finally. "We will tell them everything." The emergency meeting the next day was brutal. The boardroom that once echoed with laughter and arrogance now felt like a courtroom. Reporters had already caught wind of financial irregularities thanks to an anonymous leak, almost certainly Preston Hale's doing. Outside the building, cameras crowded the sidewalks, hungry for blood. Inside, the board members' faces were stone. "I told you this would happen," one of them said coldly. "You turned this company into a playground for moral experiments. Now it's collapsing under its own weight." Another added, "Our investors are furious. The foundation's finances are tied to company assets. If it sinks, so does Coleman Group." Richard listened silently. He'd been here before, cornered, attacked, outnumbered. In the past, he would have fought back, silenced critics with money or threats. But now, as he looked across the table, he saw not enemies, but reflections of who he used to be, men blinded by pride and fear. Finally he spoke. "You rewrite," he said. "I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people. But this foundation isn't collapsing, it's being tested, and so am I." The room fell quiet. "I won't hide this," he continued. "We'll release a full statement. We'll show every number, every audit, every account. If we lose everything, so be it. But I won't lie to the people who believed in us." The board erupted in protest. "That's suicide." One man shouted, "You will destroy your reputation." Richard stood up. "My reputation was destroyed a long time ago. What I have now is a chance to build something real. I won't lose that too." By the end of the day, the company released a public statement admitting to the embezzlement and detailing the internal corruption. They fired Thomas Gray immediately and referred the case to federal authorities. The media storm was immediate and vicious. Headlines screamed Coleman Foundation scandal, millions missing. Pundits called it proof that no redemption lasts. For a few days it seemed as if everything they'd built would collapse. Donations froze, volunteers panicked. Scholarships were delayed. Maria received hate mail accusing her of being complicit. Emily saw her mother crying at the kitchen table and didn't know what to say. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of running, Richard faced it head on. He appeared on live television, not with a lawyer or pre-team, but alone. Dressed simply in a gray sweater, he sat across from the anchor of a major news network and answered every question without deflection. "Yes," he said, "someone stole from the foundation. Yes, I trusted him. Yes, it's my fault, but this time I'm not hiding it. Transparency is how you earn trust, and I'd rather lose money than lose that again." The interview went viral. People expected him to sound defensive or rehearsed, but he didn't. He sounded honest. Meanwhile, Emily took her own stand. Without telling her mother, she wrote an open letter that she posted online titled "Don't Give Up on Good." It read, "My name is Emily Johnson. Some of you know me as the girl who stood up to a billionaire. But today, I'm asking you not to stand against him. People make mistakes. My dad used to say that when you're refixing something, it might fall apart before it works again. That doesn't mean you stop fixing it. Please don't stop believing in what we started." Within 24 hours, the letter had been shared over 1 million times. Support poured in from around the world. Donations surged again, this time larger than before. Teachers, workers, and small business owners sent in small contributions, writing messages like "For the kids," "For Emily," "For hope." When Maria showed the letter to Richard, he didn't speak for a full minute. His eyes shimmered with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Your daughter," he said softly, "she's braver than I'll ever be. She's just doing what her father taught her," Maria said. That night, for the first time in months, Richard felt something that wasn't fear or guilt, it was peace. The scandal hadn't broken the foundation, it had purified it. What survived wasn't built on money or image, it was built on truth. Weeks later, the government concluded its investigation, confirming that neither Richard nor the foundation's leadership had been involved in any wrongdoing. The headlines shifted again. Coleman cleared integrity over image. For once, the redemption arc wasn't scripted by Pre, it was earned. When the dust finally settled, Maria stood with Richard on the rooftop of the Coleman Tower, watching the city below glow like a river of light. "You could be lied," she said quietly. "You could be protected yourself." Richard smiled faintly. "Then I'd still be the man who needed protecting." She looked at him for a long moment. "You really have changed." "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I just stopped pretending." Below them, the lights of New York shimmered like a heartbeat, messy, relentless, alive. The world hadn't forgiven Richard Coleman completely, and maybe it never would. But it didn't matter. Forgiveness wasn't the goal. Growth was. When he returned to his office that night, He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the small brass lock Emily had given him. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its rough edges, then set it gently beside a framed photo of the first scholarship class. He whispered the words that had followed him since that day. Change the code. And for once he knew he already had. Spring returned to New York with the sound of renewal. The snow melted from the rooftops, the Hudson glimmered under a pale sun, and the city's rhythm seemed slower, calmer. As if even the restless heart of Manhattan needed a moment to breathe. The David Johnson Foundation, once teetering on the edge of collapse, was now stronger than ever. What had begun as one man's redemption story had evolved into something larger, an idea, a movement. A code written in the heart of the nation. In the months following the scandal, the foundation expanded into every major city in the country. What had started as scholarships had grown into a network of mentorship programs, trade schools, and community-driven education centers. The mission had changed subtly but powerfully. It wasn't just about giving kids money for college anymore. It was about giving families the tools to break cycles, to teach, to lead, to rise. Mary oversaw the expansion with a quiet determination that left everyone in awe. She no longer wore a uniform or carried a cleaning cart. Her days were filled with meetings, conferences, and school visits, yet she never let the new title make her forget where she'd come from. "I still wake up at 5, she once told a reporter. Old habits die hard. What no headline could capture, however, was the way she listened to every parent, every teacher, every student who crossed her path. Her strength wasn't in her position, it was in her empathy. Emily, now 12 going on 13, had become a reluctant celebrity. She didn't enjoy the spotlight, but she understood its power. When journalists asked her what it felt like to change the life of a billionaire, she always smiled and said, "He changed his own life. I just reminded him that he could." That simple line was quoted everywhere, from classrooms to coffee shops, from talk shows to TED Talks. It became something bigger than her, a philosophy. Richard Coleman watched it all unfold with a quiet awe. His office, once filled with luxury furniture and abstract art, now felt more like a workspace than a throne. The titanium safe still stood in the corner, but it no longer represented wealth. It was a relic of who he used to be, a reminder of how far he'd come. On his desk sat the brass lock Emily had given him, now slightly tarnished, and beside it, a photo of the first group of scholarship recipients in their caps and gowns. Corporate America had not forgiven him easily. Many of his old associates still viewed him as a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when idealism infects profit. Yet while his social standing in elite circles had crumbled, his influence in the real world had only grown. Colleges invited him to speak about ethical leadership. Former rivals quietly sought his advice. The public saw him differently now, not as a billionaire trying to save his image, but as a man trying to live differently. By early summer, something remarkable began to happen. The Change the Code movement spread beyond the foundation. Workers across industries, teachers, nurses, factory employees, retail clerks began using the phrase as a rallying cry for reform. Social media filled with stories of small acts of integrity inspired by the foundation's story. A mechanic in Ohio started free weekend workshops to teach teens car repair. A restaurant owner in Texas began paying for her staff's college classes. A retired teacher in Oregon sold her house and donated the proceeds to build a library in a low-income neighborhood. News networks tried to pin down the phenomenon, but there was no single leader, no official organization. It wasn't a campaign. It was a contagion of conscience, spreading quietly through ordinary people who decided that decency could be just as powerful as wealth. For Richard, it was both beautiful and humbling. He had spent most of his life chasing immortality through buildings, contracts, and investments. Now, the thing that carried his legacy forward wasn't his name, it was an idea he couldn't own. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his apartment overlooking Central Park, Maria called him. "Have you seen the news?" she asked. "Which part?" he said with a tired chuckle. "They're recalling it the Johnson effect. Schools across the country are adopting our mentorship model. Some states want to replicate it nationally." He smiled, though a hint of disbelief colored his voice. "The Johnson effect, sounds better than the Coleman crisis." Maria laughed softly. "You earned this, Richard." He shook his head. "No, we earned it." Meanwhile, Emily was invited to Washington, D.C., to speak at a national education summit. When she walked onto the stage, her hair neatly tied back and her small hands clutching a sheet of paper, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. She looked out at senators, governors, CEOs, and students from every background imaginable. Cameras flashed, but she didn't seem nervous. "My dad used to say a lock is only as strong as the person who builds it," she began. He thought he was talking about safes, but he was really talking about people. We all build locks around ourselves: fear, pride, greed, and then we convince ourselves they can't be opened. But they can. We just have to change the code. Her speech was short, barely 5 minutes, but it became one of the most replayed clips of the year. Commentators called her the conscience of a generation. Newspapers compared her to the young activists of history. But for Emily, it wasn't about attention. When she returned home that night, she curled up on the couch next to her mom and watched cartoons. Fame had never been the goal. The goal was the same as it had always been, to remind people that kindness mattered. Not long after the summit, President Garrett invited the Johnson family and Richard Coleman to the White House to honor their contribution to education. In a ceremony broadcast nationwide, the president presented Maria with the Medal of Civic Excellence and called her a teacher to the nation. Emily received a scholarship named in her father's honor. When it was Richard's turn, he looked visibly uncomfortable as the president shook his hand and said, "Sometimes the greatest leaders are the ones who learn to follow their conscience." After the ceremony, Richard lingered on the White House lawn, watching Emily laugh with other kids. Maria walked over and stood beside him. "You know," she said, "I think David would v liked you." Richard smiled quietly. "I think I would v liked him too." She glanced at him. "So what now? You v changed the code. What's next?" He looked up at the flag fluttering in the soft wind. "Now we make sure no one forgets how." By autumn, the foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams. It opened new campuses in Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Partnerships with universities created pipelines for underprivileged students. Even rival corporations began adopting Coleman standards, policies focused on ethical labor and education investment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once been the problem, and now he was part of the solution. But Richard never took credit. Whenever journalists tried to call him a hero, he always corrected them. "The hero is a man named David Johnson," he'd say, "and his daughter reminded me of him." Late one evening, he visited the foundation's main campus in Brooklyn. The lights of the city shimmered beyond the windows as he walked through the hallways lined with photos of smiling students. In the center of the lobby stood a plaque engraved with the foundation's motto, "Education is not charity, it's justice." Beneath it, a smaller inscription read, "Change the code." Richard ran his fingers over the words, then looked at the reflection of himself in the polished glass. For once, he didn't see a man haunted by the past. He saw someone becoming part of something larger than himself, someone human. As he left the building, he passed a group of janitors starting their night shift. One of them nodded respectfully. Richard stopped, smiled, and said, "You re the ones who keep this place running, thank you." The man grinned and replied, "We re all just doing our part, sir." Outside, the air was cool, the city alive with possibility. Richard walked toward the streetlights, his steps slow but certain. He no longer felt like a man seeking redemption. He felt like a man who had finally earned the right to start again. Somewhere far behind him, carved in stone, the words glowed faintly under the lobby lights, "Change the code." And now the world was learning how. The David Johnson Foundation had started as a story. Now it had become a language, a way for people across the world to speak about fairness, opportunity, and the courage to start over. The phrase "change the code" had crossed oceans. In London, protesters carried banners with those words as they demanded better wages for teachers. In India, rural schools painted it on their walls. In South Africa, a group of university students launched a campaign under the same name to fight corruption in education funding. What began in a single New York boardroom was now echoing in dozens of languages. By the second anniversary of the foundation, Richard Coleman found himself on a stage in Geneva, Switzerland, invited to speak at the World Education Forum. The audience was a mix of ministers, philanthropists, and journalists from around the globe. As he looked out across the vast auditorium, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, not fear, but humility. 2 years ago, he began, "I thought changing the world meant changing systems. What I learned is that you have to change people first, starting with yourself." The applause that followed was polite but genuine. Maria sat in the front row, her expression calm but proud. Emily sat beside her, now 13, her head tilted slightly as she studied the faces in the crowd. After the speech, journalists swarmed them for interviews. Cameras flashed, microphones appeared, and questions poured in about how the foundation planned to expand globally. Richard's answer surprised them. "We're not building branches," he said. "We're rebuilding bridges. The goal isn't to export our model, it's to inspire others to create their own." In the weeks that followed, the foundation began forming partnerships with schools and NGOs overseas. Maria traveled tirelessly, visiting classrooms in Brazil, Kenya, and the Philippines. She met children who reminded her of Emily, bright, curious, eager to learn. In every country, she heard the same stories told in different languages, parents sacrificing everything for education, teachers working without pay, kids walking miles to school. It reminded her of why the foundation had begun, not for charity, but for dignity. But as the movement grew, so did its challenges. Critics began to question the foundation's influence, accusing it of becoming too powerful, too political. Some governments resisted, suspicious of American philanthropy cloaked in moral rhetoric. Others tried to claim ownership of the slogan, turning Change the Code into propaganda for their own agendas. In countries with authoritarian regimes, the phrase was even banned, too dangerous, too empowering. When news broke that activists in one such country had been arrested for holding a Change the Code rally, the world erupted in outrage. Maria watched the footage in disbelief. They were using Emily's words as a crime, she said. Emily, now old enough to understand the gravity of it all, felt the weight of her name like a burden. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, she said quietly. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. You gave people hope, Emily. Hope always scares the ones who live on control. For the first time, the movement faced a moral dilemma. Should they intervene publicly and risk political backlash, or stay silent to protect their mission? The board was divided. Some argued that the foundation had no place in foreign politics. Others insisted silence would betray the very principle of truth they stood for. The decision ultimately fell to Richard. For days he wrestled with it, pacing the quiet halls of his office late into the night. The skyline outside shimmered in shades of silver and blue. And he thought about the man he used to be, the one who always calculated what was safe, what was profitable. That man would have stayed silent. But the man he was now couldn't. At a press conference the next morning, Richard stood before a sea of reporters. Cameras rolled, pens clicked. The David Johnson Foundation was built on a simple idea he began, that education is not charity, it's justice. Justice has no borders. When people are punished for wanting to learn, we cannot stay quiet. He paused, then continued. We stand with every teacher, every student, every parent who dares to change the code, no matter where they live. The statement sent ripples across the globe. Some praised his courage, others condemned his interference. Funding from several corporate partners was suspended. Stock in Coleman Group dropped again. But something else happened. Two people began to mobilize. Across continents, marches filled the streets. Students in Europe and Africa carried banners that read, Justice has no borders. The foundation's website crashed under the weight of new volunteers signing up to help. Maria received messages from teachers in dozens of countries, thanking her for standing up. One wrote, You reminded us that education is not a privilege. It's a right. But even as the movement gained strength, the cost was heavy. Threats began to arrive, emails, anonymous letters, even fake news stories accusing the foundation of corruption. Emily's school became a magnet for reporters. Maria worried constantly about her daughter's safety. One night, after a particularly stressful day, she found Richard in the foundation's empty conference room, staring at the world map pinned to the wall. Red pins marked every country they had reached. Blue ones marked the ones still waiting. This is bigger than us now, he said quietly. Bigger than anything I imagined. Maria nodded. That's what happens when you tell the truth. It keeps growing. He turned to her, exhaustion lining his face. Do you ever wonder if we went too far? She thought for a moment. No, I think maybe we didn't go far enough. The next day, Richard and Maria flew to Geneva to meet with global education leaders, including representatives from the United Nations. There they proposed a new initiative, the Open Classroom Project, designed to create digital access to education for children in conflict zones. The project would be funded not by governments or corporations, but by small, individual donations from ordinary people around the world. If we want real change, Richard told them, it has to belong to everyone. The proposal was risky, ambitious, and almost impossible to execute. But when Emily appeared at the closing session via video link, speaking to the delegates, hearts shifted. Education isn't about teaching facts, she said. It's about teaching people that they matter. That's what my dad believed. That's what we all believe. Please help us build a world where every kid gets to learn how to change their code. By the end of the summit, over 40 countries had pledged support. The foundation's movement had officially gone global. Months later, Maria and Richard stood together on a dusty field in Kenya, where the first open classroom learning center was being built. Children ran past them, laughing, barefoot, carrying handmade notebooks. Maria wiped her eyes. It's happening, she whispered. Richard smiled. It's only the beginning. That night, as they sat under the African sky, surrounded by the hum of crickets and distant laughter, Emily's voice came through on a video call. She grinned from the screen. You guys look tired. Maria laughed. Changing the world is exhausting. Then rest, Emily said. The world will still be here tomorrow. When the call ended, Richard looked up at the stars. She's wiser than both of us combined. Maria smiled softly. She always was. For a long time they sat in silence, watching the sky. Somewhere far away, in another country, another language, someone was painting the words "Change the Code" on a school wall. The world was learning, one act at a time, and for the first time in his life, Richard Coleman understood that true change doesn't end when the cameras turn off, it begins when people carry it forward. The morning it happened was ordinary. The kind that fools you into thinking everything is safe. The sun rose soft over New York, spilling gold across the skyline. The city breathed alive as always, oblivious to the fact that the world was about to stop for a few people who had tried so hard to make it better. Maria Johnson was at the Foundation's headquarters reviewing the latest progress report from Kenya. Richard was in Boston for a meeting with university partners. Emily was at her middle school, laughing with friends between classes. It was a Thursday, calm, predictable, and kind. Just before noon, Maria's phone rang. She answered without looking, expecting Claire or one of the regional coordinators. But the voice on the other end was trembling. "Mrs. Johnson, it's Principal Latham. There's been an accident." The world tilted. Maria's heart seemed to stop. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice thin. "There was a gas explosion near the cafeteria. Emily was nearby. The paramedics are taking her to St. Luke's Hospital." Maria didn't remember leaving the building. One moment she was standing in her office. The next she was running down the street, lungs burning, tears streaming, traffic blurred. Her legs carried her faster than she thought possible. By the time she reached the hospital, she was shaking so hard she could barely sign the intake papers. When the nurse finally led her into the emergency ward, her daughter was already in surgery. The waiting hours felt endless. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp and suffocating. Every time footsteps echoed in the corridor, Maria's stomach clenched. She prayed to every god she could remember from childhood, every hope she'd ever buried. Please, not her, not Emily. When Richard arrived, he looked like a ghost. He had caught the first flight from Boston and hadn't spoken a word since. He found Maria sitting on a bench outside the ICU, her face pale and hollow. He knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. "What happened?" "They said a gas line burst under the courtyard," she whispered. Emily was right there. She pushed another girl out of the way. Richard closed his eyes. He'd seen tragedy before, business collapses, scandals, even death, but never like this. This was different. This was unfair in a way numbers could never fix. Hours later, a surgeon emerged, mask pulled down, eyes heavy. "She's alive," he said softly, "but the burns are severe. The next 24 hours are critical." Maria broke then, sobbing into her hands. Richard wrapped an arm around her, his own eyes wet. The world outside went on, taxis honking, people walking, but for them, time had frozen. News of the accident spread quickly. By evening, headlines flooded social media. Emily Johnson hospitalized after school explosion. The girl who had inspired millions was now fighting for her life, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Vigils formed outside the hospital. Students lit candles and left notes that read, "Change the code for Emily." Across the country, schools held moments of silence. Even presidents and world leaders sent messages of support. Inside the hospital, Richard refused to leave. He sat beside Maria in the ECU waiting room, hour after hour, watching monitors blink behind glass. "She's strong," he said quietly. "She'll come through." Maria nodded, but her eyes never left the door. "She's just a child," she whispered. The next day, Richard made a statement to the press. Standing outside the hospital, dressed in a simple black coat. He spoke not as a CEO, but as a father figure who had found something worth believing in. "Emily has given the world courage," he said. "Now the world needs to give her ours." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and for once no one edited it out. Inside, the doctors did everything they could. Machines hummed, nurses moved like ghosts. Maria held Emily's hand, whispering stories about her father, about how he used to fix things, how he never gave up on what mattered. "You read just like him," she said through tears. "You're brave, baby. Please come back to me." Days passed. The news cycle swelled with speculation. The explosion was declared an accident, but conspiracy theories spread online, claiming it was sabotage, punishment for the Foundation's growing influence. Richard ignored them all. His only focus was the girl behind the glass. He barely ate, barely slept. Maria tried to send him home, but he refused. "She's family," he said simply. On the fifth night, the doctors said the words Maria had prayed to hear. Emily was stabilizing. She would survive. The burns would take months to heal, but her heart was strong. When Maria finally saw her conscious, her daughter's face was pale and wrapped in bandages, but her eyes, those warm brown eyes, were awake. "Mom," Emily whispered. Maria broke into tears, clutching her hand. "I'm baby. I'm right here." Emily smiled weakly. "Did they cancel school?" Richard laughed, then a rough, broken laugh that sounded like hope being reborn. "You scared the world half to death, kid," he said, leaning beside her bed. Emily looked up at him. "You look tired." He smiled softly. "You've got that effect on people." As the days turned into weeks, the world seemed to orbit around that hospital room. Letters and flowers flooded in from every continent, classrooms full of children, presidents, teachers, even janitors from Richard's old company. One envelope arrived from a small town in Kenya. Inside was a photo of students holding a sign that read, "For Emily, we rechanging the code." Richard showed it to her one afternoon. "You see," he said, Even from this bed you rechanging lives. Emily's voice was soft but steady. It's not me, Mr. Coleman, it's everyone. I just reminded them what they could do. Her recovery was slow, painful, but miraculous. Each step she took was headline news. Cameras waited outside when she was finally discharged, but Maria shielded her, insisting they go home quietly. The world can wait, she told the reporters. Right now she just needs to heal. That night, Emily sat on the small balcony of their apartment, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the city lights. Richard joined her, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Emily spoke. Why do bad things happen when you're trying to do something good? Richard looked down at his hands. Maybe because doing good means you rechanging something the world isn't ready to let go of. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Then she smiled, small and tired but bright. Then I guess we just have to keep changing it. Richard looked at her, and for the first time since the accident, he truly believed everything would be okay. The movement hadn't ended. It had simply taken on new meaning. A week later, at a private ceremony in the Foundation's New York headquarters, Mary and Richard unveiled a new wing of the program dedicated to hospital education for injured or disabled children. Its name was carved in smooth stone above the entrance, the Emily Johnson Initiative for Resilient Minds. When the curtains fell, the small crowd of teachers, doctors, and children erupted into applause. Maria wept openly. Emily stood beside her, still fragile but smiling. Richard, standing just behind them, whispered to no one in particular, "This is what forever looks like." Outside, a group of children held up hand-painted signs in bright colors, "Change the code, heal the world." And in that moment, under the soft New York sky, it was clear that the message had outgrown its creators. It was no longer just a story about wealth and redemption, or even about a girl who had once faced down a billionaire. It was a story about resilience, about what happens when pain doesn't stop you, but teaches you how to begin again. For Maria, for Richard, for Emily, and for millions of others who had found strength in their story, one truth remained unshakable: the world would never be the same again. Because now every heart that had ever been cracked by loss or failure or fear had learned one simple lesson. When life breaks you, change the code. A year after the explosion, Emily Johnson walked back into the world. The scars along her arms had faded to pale lines, and her smile had returned, softer now but no less bright. The doctors called her recovery a miracle of will. The world called it something else, a proof. Proof that courage was stronger than circumstance, that kindness could survive pain, that one girl's voice could echo farther than anyone imagined. The first time she appeared in public again was at a small event in Brooklyn. The foundation had opened a new learning center in the same borough where her father once worked as a security systems engineer. It was built inside a renovated warehouse, its walls painted in murals of books, stars, and keys, symbols of unlocking potential. There were no red carpets, no flashbulbs, no VIP lists, just teachers, students, and families who had once believed education was out of reach. Maria stood on stage, her voice trembling with pride as she introduced her daughter. When Emily first stood up to a man who thought power meant money, she said, glancing toward Richard with a warm smile, she wasn't trying to change the world. She was just telling the truth, but truth, it turns out, has a way of changing everything. When Emily stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. She looked out at the crowd, children sitting cross-legged on the floor, parents holding hands, teachers wiping away quiet tears, and began to speak. "I used to think bravery meant not being afraid," she said. "But after what happened, I learned that real bravery is being afraid and doing it anyway." Her words carried across the room, and something shifted. People weren't just inspired, they were moved. It wasn't the speech of a child prodigy or a celebrity, it was the voice of a survivor who had turned pain into purpose. Within weeks, her speech went viral. Global networks replayed it, quoting her closing line, "The world doesn't need heroes, it needs helpers." That single sentence became the motto of a new wave of activism. Students, teachers, and parents across continents began organizing community learning programs under that banner. The David Johnson Foundation found itself at the heart of what journalists began calling the education revolution. Governments took notice. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia began requesting partnerships to implement the Foundation's learning models. Universities in Europe offered joint research programs. Even corporations once skeptical started funding local initiatives. Richard Coleman, now in his mid-60s, traveled constantly. He spoke not from podiums but from classrooms, sitting with teachers and students, asking questions, listening. "When I was your age," he told one group of students in Nairobi, "I thought success was measured in numbers. Now I know it's measured in names, the names of people whose lives you've touched." He no longer wore expensive suits, he no longer spoke in rehearsed sound bites. The man who once ruled boardrooms with arrogance now moved through villages with humility. And everywhere he went, he carried a small brass lock in his pocket, Emily's gift as a reminder of why he was there. Maria, meanwhile, had become a global leader in education reform. Her speeches before the United Nations drew standing ovations. Education is not about saving the poor, she told one summit. It's about recognizing the power that already exists in them. Her words reshaped policies. Within 2 years, multiple countries passed new legislation guaranteeing access to free digital education resources. Back in New York, Emily's life had changed again. She returned to school, but on her own terms, attending part-time while mentoring younger kids through the foundation. She had no interest in fame. When a Hollywood studio offered to make a movie about her life, she politely declined. "You can't capture change in 2 hours," she said. "You have to live it." Still, she couldn't escape the attention completely. Invitations poured in from universities, talk shows, and even the Nobel Committee, which nominated the foundation for its Peace Prize. But Emily remained grounded. She still rode the subway. She still did her homework at the kitchen table. And she still called Richard Coleman, though he often told her to drop the formality. As the movement grew, so did its reach. The foundation launched its most ambitious project yet, the Global Learning Network, a digital platform connecting teachers and students from over 50 countries through free lessons and mentorship. The goal was to break down the barriers of geography, language, and privilege to make learning a universal right. The launch event took place in New York, in the same tower where everything had begun years earlier. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There were no business suits, no laughter at someone else's expense, no arrogance. Instead, children from around the world joined virtually, their faces projected on giant screens across the room. When Richard took the stage, his voice trembled with emotion. "Years ago," he said, "this building represented everything I thought made me powerful. Today it represents everything that makes me human." He paused, glancing toward Maria and Emily in the front row. "The first time I offered this girl money, it was to humiliate her. The second time, it was to build something better. And every day since, she's reminded me that the world doesn't change when the rich give, it changes when they listen." The crowd rose in applause. Cameras captured the moment, but even through the bright lights, Richard's eyes were fixed on Emily. She smiled back, and in that unspoken exchange was the entire story: forgiveness, growth, and the kind of love that doesn't need words. After the event, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city, Maria turned to Richard. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" "All the time," he said. "But if I hadn't been who I was, I wouldn't have met who I needed to become." Emily leaned against the railing beside them, the wind brushing her hair. "You know," she said, "I think Dad would like this view." Maria smiled. "He would loved it." Richard looked at her, then at the skyline that stretched endlessly into the night. "So what's next for us?" he asked. Maria's eyes shone. "We keep teaching, we keep building, we keep changing the code." And they did. Months later, the Global Learning Network connected over 2 million students worldwide. Villages that had never had electricity before now had solar-powered classrooms. Refugee children in war-torn regions attended lessons taught by volunteers from across the globe. In a world often divided by borders, politics, and fear, education became the bridge, a shared act of faith in what humanity could be. Reporters called it the Second Renaissance. Historians called it the Johnson Legacy. But for those who were part of it, for Maria, for Richard, for Emily, it was simply life continuing, one lesson at a time. One evening, long after the applause had faded, Richard visited David Johnson's grave in Queens. He knelt by the headstone, the brass lock in his hand. "I didn't know you," he said quietly, "but you changed me all the same. You built the kind of legacy I never could. And I promise you I'll protect it." He placed the lock on the grave, clicked it shut, and whispered, "We changed the code." As he walked away, the city lights flickered in the distance, not the cold glow of greed, but the warm, steady light of purpose. And somewhere, in classrooms from New York to Nairobi, children were learning not just how to read or write, but how to dream, how to believe that they, too, could change the world by changing the code. The movement had started with a challenge, survived a tragedy, and grown into a revolution. But its greatest triumph was this: it had taught humanity how to rebuild itself, one open heart, one open mind at a time. 10 years later, the world had changed quietly, profoundly, and irreversibly. The David Johnson Foundation had become one of the most influential education movements in modern history. The words "change the code" were carved into the entrance of schools from Brooklyn to Bangladesh. Governments cited it in legislation. Activists printed it on banners. Teachers used it as the type for lesson plans. For an entire generation, it wasn't just a slogan. It was a way of life. But for the people who had started it, life had grown simpler. Maria Johnson, now in her early 50s, stood in the courtyard of the Foundation's global headquarters in New York, the same site where she had once cleaned floors for a living. Now, the building hummed with life, classrooms filled with students, offices filled with teachers, walls lined with art from every corner of the world. She walked through the garden every morning, coffee in hand, nodding to the staff who greeted her with respect that still felt surreal. She didn't see herself as an executive or a public figure. To her, she was still just a teacher who wanted to make learning fair. She had changed the foundation structure years earlier, decentralizing it so that no one person held too much power, a lesson learned the hard way. Every major decision was now voted on by educators, students, and community leaders. The best system, she often said, is one that doesn't need heroes to survive. Her daughter had grown into one of those leaders. At 23, Emily Johnson was no longer the shy girl who had faced down a billionaire in a boardroom. She was now a woman with a voice that carried across continents. She had graduated from Columbia University with a degree in social policy but had never left the foundation. Instead, she led the Youth Initiative Division, overseeing projects run by students for students. Her office was filled with photos not of awards or famous faces, but of children from around the world holding signs that read "Change the Code." She had traveled to 40 countries by the time she turned 20. Everywhere she went, people knew her name, yet fame never hardened her. When reporters asked what it felt like to be a global icon, she always gave the same answer: it feels like responsibility. She still carried faint scars on her arms, reminders of the explosion that nearly took her life, but she didn't hide them. "They re not what happened to me," she once said during an interview. "They re what I lived through." As for Richard Coleman, time had softened him in ways he never expected. His once dark hair had turned silver, his confident stride had slowed. But his eyes, sharp, curious, searching, still carried that same light Emily had sparked in him years ago. He had retired from the corporate world long ago, selling off his remaining business interests and donating most of his fortune to the foundation's endowment. The press called it the greatest act of giving by a private citizen in modern American history. Richard didn't see it that way. "Giving back implies it was mine to begin with," he said once in an interview. It never was. He spent his later years mentoring young entrepreneurs in ethical leadership and volunteering as a guest lecturer at community colleges. Students loved him not because he was a billionaire, but because he was honest. He never hid his past. "I built my success on pride," he would tell them. "I built my peace on humility. Trust me, one is worth far more than the other." He still met with Maria and Emily often. Every few months they would gather at the Johnsons' apartment for dinner, something simple, usually pasta or soup, just like old times. Maria would scold him for eating too little. Emily would tease him about finally learning to cook. They would talk about the foundation, the students, the stories that kept them going. One autumn evening, as the city glowed in shades of amber and gold, the three of them sat on the balcony watching the sunset. Below them, the hum of New York traffic blended with distant laughter. Richard looked out over the skyline, his voice quiet. "Do you ever think about how small it all was at the start? Just one stupid bet." Maria smiled softly. "Sometimes it takes something stupid to reveal something beautiful." Emily rested her chin on her hand. "I think everything starts small, even change." Richard nodded slowly, "And then it grows bigger than you can imagine." A soft breeze passed through, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Maria turned to him. "You know, Richard," she said gently, "you could have walked away 1,000 times. But you didn't. Why?" He thought for a long moment before answering. Because for once, walking away would have been the wrong kind of easy. It was the kind of truth that lingered long after the conversation ended. Months later, the foundation announced its next great endeavor, the Coleman Johnson Institute for Global Education, a research and training center dedicated to reforming education policy worldwide. Richard insisted that his name be listed second. "On the footnote," he said, "she's the headline." At the Institute's groundbreaking ceremony, Emily gave a speech that echoed across the plaza. "My father taught me to open locks," she said. "Coleman taught me to open minds, and my mother taught me that the hardest doors to open are the ones inside ourselves." The audience stood applauding through tears. Even Richard, who prided himself on restraint, couldn't stop smiling. A few months later, Richard's health began to fail. The doctors called it heart failure, though Maria privately believed it was something gentler, a heart too full of life finally slowing down. When the end came, it was quiet. He passed away in his sleep, a photograph of Maria and Emily on his bedside table, and the small brass lock resting in his hand. The news broke worldwide, but the headlines were simple: Richard Coleman, the billionaire who changed the code, dies at 73. Flags at foundation campuses around the world were lowered to half staff. Candlelight vigils were held in cities from New York to Nairobi. Students shared stories online about how his work had changed their lives. At his memorial, Maria spoke first. Her voice wavered, but her words were strong. Richard once thought legacy meant buildings and balance sheets. But his true legacy is the people who learned to believe because he did. Emily followed, standing at the podium with tears glistening in her eyes. He wasn't perfect, she said. None of us are. But he was proof that people can change and that change can change the world. After the ceremony, they buried him next to David Johnson in Queens. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed heavy with memory, as the final handful of dirt fell onto his coffin. Maria reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver key, the one that had once fit the brass lock Emily gave him years ago. She placed it gently on the grave. Now it's open, she whispered. Years later, when historians wrote about the Change the Code movement, they often ended it with that image, a key resting on a grave, symbolizing the opening of something much larger than one life. Emily, now grown and leading the foundation in her mother's place, often visited that cemetery. She would bring fresh flowers, sit between the two headstones, and talk as if they were still there. You'd both be proud, she'd say softly. We did it. The code changed. And as she stood beneath the swaying trees, listening to the hum of the city beyond the gates, she realized something her father had once told her was true. Change wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was a quiet, patient kind of miracle, one that began with a single choice to be better. In the end, Change the Code was never just a movement. It was a reminder that humanity at its best could rewrite its own story. And somewhere, in a classroom full of children who would never know the full tale, a teacher smiled and wrote those 3 words on the board. Change the code. And the world kept learning. The story of Change the Code isn't just about a billionaire, a mother, and a young girl. It's about the fragile architecture of humanity itself, and how easily we forget the foundations that hold it together. It begins in arrogance and ends in understanding, tracing a journey that reveals something deeper than redemption, the rediscovery of empathy in a world that measures worth by wealth. The lesson it carries is both ancient and urgent. Real power has nothing to do with control, and everything to do with compassion. At its heart, the story reminds us that the divide between privilege and humility is not as wide as we think. It's a line drawn in the mind, one that can be erased with a single act of truth. When Richard Coleman first challenged young Emily Johnson to open his unbreakable safe, he wasn't just testing her intelligence, he was asserting dominance, trying to prove that the poor belonged beneath the rich. But Emily's quiet defiance shattered that illusion. She didn't fight him with anger or envy. She fought him with understanding, with the kind of wisdom that innocence sometimes holds, uncorrupted by cynicism. Her victory wasn't over a man or a machine, it was over the idea that one life could be worth more than another. Through that moment, we learn that humanity's greatest transformations rarely come from force, they come from perspective. Emily didn't just expose Richard's arrogances, she held up a mirror that made him confront his emptiness. In a world obsessed with appearance, her simple honesty became a revolution. It reminds us that moral courage doesn't require status or education or age, it requires heart. The smallest voice, when it speaks truth, can echo louder than the richest man's command. But what makes this story enduring isn't only that the powerful were humbled, it's that the humbled refused to hate. Maria Johnson, a mother who had every reason to despise the man who humiliated her, chose forgiveness over bitterness. She accepted his apology not because he deserved it, but because the world needed what could grow from it. Her grace teaches that forgiveness is not surrender, it is strength. It doesn't erase the past, it redefines it. By choosing to help Richard build the foundation instead of walking away, Maria turned pain into purpose, proving that healing the world begins with healing one another. Richard's transformation, meanwhile, shows that redemption is not a single moment, it's a lifelong practice. Change, in his case, wasn't just about charity or public gestures, it was about learning to live differently when no one was watching. He began his journey thinking power was the ability to command others. He ended it understanding that true power is the ability to lift others. His evolution mirrors a truth too often forgotten in modern society: success measured by profit is hollow, but success measured by people lasts forever. The foundation he helped create, the David Johnson Foundation, wasn't built from guilt. It was built from awakening. And that's another lesson this story holds: we are all capable of changing our code. We all carry within us the programming of ego, fear, greed, and pride. But just as a safe can be reset, so can the human spirit. The moment we choose empathy over ego, generosity over gain, the code shifts. And when enough people shift, the world rewrites itself. Emily's journey, especially after her accident, deepens that message. Her survival wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Even in pain, she continued to inspire, showing that brokenness doesn't disqualify us from making a difference. It connects us more deeply to those who suffer. Her scars became her strength, a visual reminder that growth often comes from the very wounds that once hurt us most. When she told the world doesn't need heroes, it needs helpers, She distilled the entire philosophy of change into a single, luminous truth. It's not grand gestures that transform the world, but small acts of care repeated by millions. The global movement that followed the spreading of Change the Code reveals the ripple effect of goodness. A single act of compassion can travel farther than any act of cruelty. When humanity sees itself reflected in kindness, it remembers its purpose. The story shows that education, empathy, and equality are not luxuries, they are the true currencies of civilization. What began as a local foundation became a global awakening because people saw themselves in it not as victims or villains, but as builders of a better world. And yet, the lesson is not that goodness is easy. Every transformation in the story came at a cost. Richard lost friends, wealth, and reputation. Mary endured fear and heartbreak. Emily nearly lost her life. The movement faced resistance, corruption, and tragedy. But through every hardship, they learned the same thing: goodness is not fragile, it's resilient. It survives humiliation, betrayal, even pain. It doesn't fade under pressure, it shines brighter because of it. When Richard died, holding the small brass lock that once symbolized everything he misunderstood about power, it felt like a final metaphor. The lock had once represented what he owned, now it represented what he had opened his heart. His death wasn't an ending, but a passing of light from one generation to the next. Maria and Emily carried that light forward, proving that legacy isn't what we leave behind, it's what we awaken in others. Ultimately, Change the Code teaches us that humanity's greatest revolution isn't technological or political, it's emotional. It happens when we reprogram ourselves to value empathy over ego, truth over illusion, and unity over division. It asks each of us to look inward and ask, what code am I living by? Is it the one written by fear and greed, or the one written by courage and love? The story doesn't end with applause or perfection. It ends with continuity, with children learning, with teachers teaching, with ordinary people carrying forward a message born from extraordinary hearts. Because the goal was never to create heroes. It was to create a world where heroes aren't needed, where kindness is instinct and justice is habit. In the end, Change the Code is a parable about the possibility of redemption in a cynical world. It whispers that no one is beyond saving, not the powerful, not the broken, not the lost. It reminds us that every system, no matter how corrupt, can be rewritten if enough people believe it should be. And it tells us that the code that truly matters isn't written in laws or ledgers, it's written in the choices we make every day, when no one is watching. So when we read the story of Richard, Maria, and Emily, we were not just reading about them. We were reading about ourselves, our flaws, our fears, our hopes, our potential. We were being asked quietly but urgently to change the code in our own lives, to see others not as obstacles or tools, but as mirrors, to use our power, however small, to unlock someone else's door. Because when one person changes, the world shifts just a little. And when enough of us do, the code that governs humanity rewrites itself line by line, heart by heart, until compassion becomes the new default. That is the true lesson of Change the Code. It's not a story about wealth or forgiveness or even education. It's a story about remembering what it means to be human and daring to stay that way in a world that keeps trying to forget. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.